In the early 19th century, the region that today we might call Cascadia was a pretty untouched place. The Columbia River became an important piece of infrastructure in the ever-expanding fur trade of Canada, and Cascadia became especially important once the Athabasca Pass was discovered by David Thompson thanks to an Iroquoian guide humbly called Thomas. David Thompson completed this expedition to find Athabasca Pass, which was just a footpath through the Rocky Mountains into what we'd now call British Columbia in 1811. Which is just a quarter century before the events of Victoria III. In real life, the Columbia District very quickly became, essentially, a Hudson's Bay Company territory that was disputed with the Americans who had found a separate path to Oregon via the Oregon Trail. It wasn't until the 1840s that the British and Americans drew a proper border in the area, much to the Americans' benefit, as the Hudson's Bay Company had outcompeted the American Pacific Fur Company that tried to move in. It was actually because of increasing hostilities in the War of 1812 that the American Pacific Fur Company liquidated and left the area, leaving two Canadian fur companies, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, to compete amongst themselves. Based on the fact that we still have the Hudson's Bay Company today in Canada, I think you can tell who won that competition. Either way, for this reason, the Columbia District's existence in Victoria III is kind of ahistorical in and of itself. It really should be part of the Hudson's Bay Company, but thanks to this ahistorical move, we have the opportunity to play a pretty unique country here in Victoria III. What makes the Columbia District unique is that it has both Anglo-Canadian and Yankee primary culture to represent the relatively peaceful coexistence of American and Canadian people in the area until the borders were drawn in the 40s. This is of interest to us because of two things. First, it costs less infamy to take land which is a homeland for your primary culture, meaning we can, in theory, conquer American Yankee homelands for less infamy than the other Canadians. And we have the opportunity to form the extremely rare tag of the Free States of America. This is indeed a very special tag because upon forming it, we lose our Canadian culture to replace it with Afro-American culture and the implementation of multiculturalism via event. Yes, that's right, the Free States of America are the only way to implement multiculturalism without needing an anarchist, humanitarian, or enlightened royalist. Amazing, isn't it? The only problem is, of course, defeating America as a British puppet. Yeah, Columbia is, in this point of history, quite weak, but we'll play to our strengths and take over Canada to create a Canada dominated by the West. Okay, that was a very long intro, sorry. This run is personal to me because I'm from British Columbia, so I'm obliged to delve into my own history if I'm going to play it in Victoria III, of course. Let's go confederate Canada and conquer America now. If you haven't played Canada before, then you may not be aware of how the Confederation of Canada works. Once you research nationalism, you can start absorbing neighboring Canadians that you have high relations with and a superior GDP to. Colombia is a pretty strong contender for the Canadian Confederation since they've got a lot of goods, resources, and pops, but you'll have to outcompete the HBC if you want to make it east. And at first, the HBC has a much higher GDP than you. Thankfully, the AI isn't always very smart with what it builds, while you can be very smart with it. Logging camps are an extremely strong building because they cost very little construction compared to other industries in return for a relatively high amount of GDP, since wood is in high demand across the British market. One other advantage we have over the other Canadians is that we're big enough to welcome mass migrations with immense consistency. Your mass migration attraction is massively reduced if you have less than 3 incorporated states, but the Columbia District just so happens to have 3 incorporated states and 1 colony in Idaho. For that reason, dropping greener grass decrees across all our states except Idaho will see the people of Europe and America coming to our humble colony for work, which we will provide. Logging is a staple industry of even today's British Columbia, and we'll be starting that industry here for sure. Funnily enough, you probably shouldn't build in BC because the Rocky Mountains massively harm your construction efficiency, but man, let me be biased towards my home. If you're playing optimally, build mostly in Washington and Oregon, since the construction malice isn't nearly as bad there. Of course, you'll have to hope that Britain doesn't just give up your Yankee states to America once they find the Oregon Trail, but surely a skilled player can find a way to not let that happen, right? Being a British subject sucks, man. One immediate recommendation I have that goes against what most of my other guides tell you is that laissez-faire as a British subject is very scary. With interventionism, you can hold on to your businesses without fear, but under laissez-faire, it's the Wild West, and the British are all too happy to buy everything in your country and ruin your liberty desire. The more of your GDP that Britain owns, the more they'll tick down your liberty desire, and while for now we won't be gunning for independence, we don't want the British to be holding us down forever. While we're with the British, we definitely want to use their market the best we can. We can sap immigrants off of their market, be it from India, Hong Kong, or from the British Isles themselves, and we can use their resources in the market for some very strong production methods. Back to the important issue of confederation though. We need to improve relations with Britain and our fellow Canadians. Researching nationalism will take 3 years, and there's no point speeding this up with a costly university because we can't confederate until we get to 50 relations with both the HBC and Britain anyway. While we're working on our HBC relations, we can preemptively get relations with the Eastern Canadians up since we have nothing better to do. Thanks to our lumber camps, our GDP will increase pretty heavily without a ton of effort. On very low construction nations like Colombia, it's very powerful to make low construction cost industries like logging instead of something like groceries, even though groceries are in high demand in the British market. An individual grocery industry might have a higher profit, but we can build 4 logging camps in the time it takes to make 1 grocery industry, so we're much better off just logging. It goes without saying that if Britain goes to war, don't help them, since we get nothing for helping them anyway. I do think it would be wise for Victoria 3 to put in the Hearts of Iron system where subjects gain progress towards autonomy by participating in wars. In the case of Vic 3, it could be a separate bar that tracks how much you've earned autonomy by your participation in wars and contribution to the market, which decays based on your liberty desire. Anyway, ignore all wars and just make logging camps. We have some pretty good profits in BC, with a lot of it being deleted due to being government owned, but it's better than the British owning it. We also are supporting our budget using government owned stuff since we really don't want to charge taxes. Our lifeblood is immigration, since without it we can't employ in our businesses, and if we charge higher taxes, standard of living will go down, and with it our immigration numbers. Once you've got a relatively stable budget, I do recommend jumping to iron construction since the British market has lots of available tools and iron to fund it, and iron construction is just so much better than wooden construction. I did so in May of 1839, which I chose to do once I had a nice collection of government logging camps which could fund the new construction costs. It was shortly after that I confederated with the HBC, and this leads to the unfortunate issue of the company having basically no administrative buildings while all their states are instantly incorporated. The HBC normally doesn't have most of its territory incorporated, so they don't bother to make any administration, but once you confederate, everything is instantly incorporated. Having low bureaucracy is always a problem since it creates tax waste, but it is especially a problem when you rely on government dividends to fund your budget since it reduces government dividend efficiency. I'll have to rush out some administrative buildings which I'll put in British Columbia since I expect this place will need the tax capacity in the future once more immigrants arrive. Either way, taking in the HBC secures us as the most powerful Canadian nation since the HBC has a lot of GDP, pushing the total GDP over 1 million. The other Canadians are unlikely to reach the 1 million mark, let alone surpass it. Unfortunately, our new administrations are a bit costly, so the budget is tanking, which is especially harmful to my budget because of its dependence on government industry. Taking on debt decreases government dividend efficiency, just like having low bureaucracy, so each week that I fail to fix the deficit, the issue gets worse. In better news though, I'm getting pharmaceuticals, which will let me get healthcare. This matters because we can gain an extra 2 points of standard of living across the board with public healthcare, and that will bring in even more immigrants. We desperately need the labor, so it'll be quite helpful for us. One thing about high immigration builds for Canada is that although we don't have a lot of jobs to hand out yet, new immigrants can still find work as peasants, which is better than nothing. Also, those peasants will pay a land tax that, although small, does help fix the budget problem. One shortcut to help get out of a deficit is to privatize, which we want to use sparingly here in Canada for fear of British economic dominance. In this case though, as my deficit mounts, a bit of privatization isn't too bad. Throughout all this time, I've been slowly confederating with more of Canada, and I got Quebec in January of 1845. One interesting occurrence in this particular run is that Britain chose to grab the militarized industry principle and max it out in their power block. This matters because at level 3, this principle unlocks access to the balloon reconnaissance mobilization option, which gives a hefty bonus to occupation speed. This could prove very useful for fighting the Americans who have a lot of open territory through the Midwest, but in all honesty, balloon reconnaissance is kind of pretty good all around whether in the Midwest or not. We'll see if it gets put to good use. It is nice to have cheaper military goods too, but it won't make much difference while the army is relatively small. I saw that the Americans were manifesting their destiny against Mexico, which happened just a bit earlier than I was expecting. A portion of the strategy for this run is based around conquering states from America right when they take them from Mexico and add the Yankee homelands to them, but before they can incorporate them. Taking a state, which is your primary culture's homeland, cuts infamy down by 20%, while taking an unincorporated state cuts it in half, additively, so we'd be taking on 70% less infamy if we could time this correctly. I can't start a play while I'm a puppet though, so I can't move in on the states until I confederate Canada, which will promote me to Dominion status. That is unfortunately some ways away, since even if I confederate with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, I'll need to finish colonizing Alberta and Manitoba before I'll even have enough states to finish the journal entry, or somehow get Newfoundland from Britain. The latter will not happen. The Americans completed their war and even took the Rio Grande estuary from Mexico, but they haven't quite finished their colonies yet. The journal entries that America gets from Manifest Destiny will add Yankee homelands to everything except Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, but only once they completely control all the states, including Montana, which takes a long time to colonize on account of its size. The journal entry that gives those homelands is split in two though, and the Americans have taken enough Mexican land to get homelands on California, Nevada, Arizona, and other southern, western, and southwestern states. I saw that they were starting to incorporate California, and it would only take 2 years. There's no way I can obtain Dominion status and invade before at least California is incorporated, so I'll have to pay some infamy for it, but at least it's a Yankee homeland, so it'll be a little bit lower infamy-wise, but not as low as I'd have liked. By this point, I control all of Canada, but I can't finish the Confederation yet because of how slow colonization is. It's not really something I can reasonably speed up, since even if my colony growth were to increase, I'm at the hard cap of 50 days per province. I can get to 25 through colonization rights, but that's just luck based around when the natives rise up. By 1852, I'm able to form Canada, but once I do that, I won't be able to form the Free States, so I'd rather not. It also really wouldn't get me anything, since adding Franco-Canadian as its primary culture would give me, in theory, lower infamy to conquer land that I already own, whereas Yankee primary culture gives me an infamy discount on most of the United States, which are higher population and just more valuable in general than any of the Franco-Canadian states. Look, I'm a Canadian, and it hurts me to say this stuff, but I mean, New York or Quebec, you know what I'm taking. Unfortunately for my ambitions to conquer America, my enemies were having a very strong game, and thanks to their rapid conquest of the West and solid relations with Britain, I lost control over the Pacific Northwest of America when Britain signed a treaty with the Americans. This is definitely suboptimal. I was so focused on finishing up the colonization of Alberta that I didn't even notice at first, but once I did notice, it definitely hurt. I had invested quite a bit into Washington and Oregon, both in terms of construction and migration. Soon after though, I did finish the Canadian Confederation 11 years early compared to real life, and finally became a Dominion. With Dominion status comes the option to begin diplomatic plays, and as a British subject, it's not too hard to get a powerful army to back my plays. So I have to be upfront here. The wars against the US were something I reloaded over and over again because I knew I could win them, just from my instincts about how overpowered naval invasions are. But it was dependent on the British not capitulating early, which they love to do, and on the American armies being a little bit stupid with their placements. I was being very ambitious in this war, taking pretty much the entire West and Midwest of America, if only because the maneuver cost on these tiny states is so low, and the infamy cost is negligible for the many territories in the region. Each war against the Americans is basically a death war, so I have to go all in on these wars and put down a ton of war goals, even if getting those war goals may be difficult. One strategy that likely would have helped me would have been to pull Britain in with a war goal on Liberia, which could have stopped them from capitulating so fast, since they'd have more reason to stay in the war. But it costs a lot more maneuvers to request that than to offer an obligation, and that means fewer conquests. I'll find a way to make this work. So, the crux of this strategy is one which I would refine on further resets, but essentially, the American-Canadian border forms one massive, ridiculous front line on which Americans will fight British and Canadian armies mostly in the east, since my capital is Ontario, and their capital is in DC. The Americans left not a soul in California, so I'll be naval invading there with an army of half cavalry and half infantry. I can use the rapid advance strategy with that ratio, plus the British have militarized Industry 3, so I have balloon reconnaissance. This gives me a massive boost to my occupation speed. In theory, I can push across the plains right to DC while the American army struggles to move its men. Then Victoria 3's front system haunts me again. The moment I took Idaho, the fronts connected, and now that monstrous front line from New Brunswick to British Columbia has been extended down to New Mexico, all as one big front line. I would need to somehow prevent my army from occupying Idaho for this strategy to work, and well, there's really no way to do that. Even with an objective marked in DC, the army will tend to spread its occupation outwards and not spearhead to an objective, which is very frustrating. It's okay though. I ended up losing this war and reloading so I could try some other techniques. I came in on a fresh day of rest, ready to try out some new ideas. I put in the same war goals as before and called in Britain with an obligation. The new plan is to invade the Rio Grande since its HQ isn't Dixie. DC is in Dixie HQ-wise, so it's pretty much always garrisoned. Sometimes the New England HQ can be open, but it's easy for the American army to respond to an invasion there, so I'd like to invade the Rio Grande HQ, which the Americans happen to have taken. Unfortunately, yet again, the same frontline shenanigans have screwed me. The army was moving fast while American armies were heading southwest to stop me, but I had free reign briefly until the frontline moved in such a way that my army then had to travel for weeks to get back to the front. But the desired effect had been caused to some extent. You'll notice that the American armies leaving the big front line have given us an advantage on that front, so I got rid of my general on the main army and disbanded the rapid advance cavalry army, which put all 4 generals on the main army. I did it this way because the generals get to keep the rapid advance tactic despite the cavalry ratio being off, at least until I change the tactic, at which point rapid advance will once again be locked off. Then, I was once again ruined by front lines because once my army took North Dakota, they were forced to relocate back to the front for no reason. I really can't make this stuff up, man. Everything I try gets ruined by front lines being broken, and I just have to suck it up and live with it. By this point, the Rio Grande has been freed, but 76 American battalions are in the south now, giving me precious little time before the front line restabilizes. In theory, I can repeat this process over and over to eventually push to DC through New York, but I'll spoil it for you now. The British will always capitulate before that works, and if they capitulate, I capitulate. I was making pretty good progress as I had taken New York, and the British still had positive war support, but of course, since Britain has no interest in this war in the form of war goals on them or war goals for them, they're all too happy to just wipe peace at any time, which they did in March of 1858. I need another new plan, or a fixed frontline system, and only one of those is in my power. I'm going for the same war again, but this time I'll go for naval landings in the New England HQ while the American army is busy taking back the Rio Grande. If I can grab a landing in something like Delaware or New Jersey, I can get to DC before anyone can respond, and then just hold it long enough to win. This strategy relies on the British knocking the American fleet out of the sea nodes I need though, which is surprisingly unreliable because of how stupidly the AI uses its fleets in general, but sometimes an opportunity opens up. I landed in Delaware successfully, and I was praying that the army would go to DC on the open front through Maryland, but they went to Pennsylvania, creating a new front. This wasn't so bad though, since I do now have a front right up against DC, but getting my army to do battles in this critical state is pretty much impossible with how random the battles are. I was not able to get the battles to go to DC since I have no real control over it anyway, and because of that, the war still ended in a white peace, although Britain did hold out until 0 war support this time. I got closer, but we'll have to try again. I did the same strategy, but just hoped for better luck with my landings in Delaware, and this seemed like it would be the inevitable winning strategy, although I'd need just the right circumstances for it to work out. I landed in New Jersey, but then my army invaded New York instead of Delaware, so once again the fronts connected and my strat was ruined. To see if maybe this could work, I landed in California as well to make more fronts, but ultimately, the British are just too cowardly to make it work. I kept hitting my head against this brick wall, and finally had a breakthrough when the Americans just left DC open by accident. I don't know why they did this, but I pounced and managed to occupy DC. I just need to hold it now, and I can actually win this war. Finally, I had the Americans in the negative on war support, which is crazy for me, but my front line wasn't looking too good, and I was just hoping that I could hold out long enough to win. I watched as my grip on Washington DC just barely slipped before I could win, with the Americans at negative 93 support, with maybe just one more day of time needed for the next tick, and then the Americans retook DC, and I was never going to get it back before the British, of course, white-pieced. We were kicked from Virginia, and my heart sank, but Britain was still fighting. I did have a chance. If I could just land at DC again for even 1 week, I could win. I began defaulting later in the war just from the immense cost of all my conscripts, but surely I can still win even with no money, since all I need is 1 landing. I did land in Delaware, and I was so excited, but my army went to New Jersey and then to New York, connecting the front lines again instead of rushing for DC, which may have won me the war. But look, Dixie HQ is open. I went for DC, and then Britain signed an extremely cursed peace deal with America. You can actually see me land in DC for a moment, but Britain already made the deal, and with it, I lost control of the prairies but gained most of the west of the states. This was certainly a strange deal, and one where East and West have been cut off from each other. I'd have to make ports in Quebec or something to reconnect the markets, and I don't really want to deal with that, especially considering how much I screwed up my economy during this war, so I'm going to reload once again. Just to demonstrate what the borders would look like if I were to actually win this war, I swapped countries and surrendered. This is what I want to have happen, but even with those states, I'm pretty far from making the free states. I kept playing a few years to see how long until the Civil War fired, since I had a feeling it would be soon, and it did indeed happen, but I'm not planning to keep this playthrough going on the cheated timeline since this was just a demonstration of the intention behind the war. I reloaded to before declaring the war and decided to put off fighting the Americans until I was a bit stronger, since apparently defeating the Americans just isn't possible even though I was so close. We shall instead continue the game, accepting that the Americans shall maintain their territory while I build up a more prosperous Canada and keep an eye out for the Civil War, which may be an opportunity to get that land. I named this section after all the Frontline problems I had, mostly because it genuinely became the focus of my run and highlights one of the more frustrating things about Victoria 3. I talked a lot about stuff that frustrates me in Victoria 3 over on the Honest Victorians podcast, where I discussed quite a bit of stuff with the hosts Chum, Smithy, and Technocrat, including my thoughts on the journey of Victoria 3 so far. If you're interested in a podcast about Victoria 3, check my episode out sometime. I was having budget issues, so it was finally time to completely privatize the economy, which was scary because I thought the British might take it all away, but it turns out my investment pool was pretty large, so I had a relatively domestic economy by the time most of it privatized. Most of my debt was paid off, and the loss of those interest payments fixed up a lot of my budget issues, but then the British had my liberty desire pretty low, and I was very afraid that they'd make me a puppet again, which would ruin this playthrough completely. I need the British to help me fight the Americans, but I don't want to be attached to them so closely like this because they'll steal away all my money. Who I do want to be attached to is you, personally, the viewer. Subscribe, so I can beat Lemon Cake in the sub race to 25k. He's a menace and cannot be allowed to win. While the Americans were in the South continuing the war against Mexico, the tensions of the issue of slavery boiled up into a civil war, with the Free American separatists rising up from the North to push forward their agenda of abolition. This is actually a great opportunity for me, as now I can surely defeat the Americans in a war without too much trouble, right? They're at war with Mexico and themselves. Regardless of the opportunity's advantage for me, I will soon be turned into a puppet by Britain, so I really need to act. Rather than do some crazy naval invasion strategy, I chose instead to do a traditional invasion from the northwest and push across to DC, or perhaps even just occupy all my war goals naturally, since everything I'm claiming is in the west. Britain finally reduced my autonomy at this point, which is the catalyst I needed to start looking for someone to support my independence. The obvious, and really only choice, is France. The American War ended in 1862, with my first actual conquest being done, although I committed some pretty bad border gore by not grabbing Oregon, so my bad. I'll fix that up later. I'd like to continue my momentum and fight the Free Americans, but I'm a puppet. Very sad. Quick note that I went into debug mode and just gave myself Oregon because it was really bothering me that it wasn't mine, and I think we're all better for this, trust me. As part of my work to become free from Britain, I'm improving relations with the British Raj and France, who I'm hoping to work with in my fight for freedom, and I'm also researching some new military tech. Losing access to the British market is by far the most painful part of this process, but I'm big enough by this point that I do believe I can sustain a market all of my own. My attempts to get the Raj on my side worked, as they now support my independence, and the big help behind that will be that the British will dedicate many men to that front in India instead of against me, but I still need France's help to possibly win. I managed to get my liberty desire to the max level, but I need to wait for my obligation to wear off with Britain, as I still owe them for helping me out against America. With that, the waiting game begins, as I have secured French and Indian support. They should be enough together to get me the win. I went for my independence in 1871 with the added goal of grabbing Newfoundland and the option to increase my autonomy in case independence becomes, for whatever reason, a better alternative. I also had a very cursed government, with the ultra-tent Liberal Party composed of, well, everyone. We've got the industrialists, the trade unions, the farmers, the academics, and the small business owners, all working together for Canadian freedom. That's what you love to see. I pretty much immediately occupied Newfoundland, then just sat around while India fought the war with French support. There's really not much to do besides wait for British war support to go down. It will take some time, but as of now, I hold all the war goals. I was confused though when I saw that I was losing war support, and I realized that just because I have my war goals doesn't mean I can't capitulate. You see, the British have no war goals on me, so I can't be locked at 0 how I normally was, as the British don't occupy my land, and I was very scared of getting capitulated randomly. That being said, the British were also landing in Quebec, and my army couldn't travel fast enough to defend it because of how big Canada is, so that was really annoying. Thankfully, my capital is in Ontario, so I do still have the war goal, but my war exhaustion will tick much faster with their occupation of Quebec and the Maritimes. It was in 1872 that my war support was about to capitulate me, so I struck a deal with the British where the French would give up all their war goals, and in return, I'd get my independence, which, looking at my stats right now, almost feels like it wasn't worth it. I was horrifically dependent on the British market, so I lost my source of goods and my source of pops to sell to, but most importantly, I lost my source of immigrants, as the vast British Empire had been sending me tons of pops previously, all in search of that sweet Canadian healthcare. My prime objective at this point is, of course, to break free of my debt, So I put up taxes for a while and got my prices rebalanced with some new domestic industries in preparation for war with the Americans, free and slaver alike. I went after the Americans in November 1874 as my budget was pretty healthy and my debt was almost gone. I really wanted to pounce on America since their industry is very strong and may eventually give them an edge over me. That, and I can't form the Free States of America while the Free States of America exist, so that needs to be rectified as soon as possible. The free American capital is in Pennsylvania, which was easy to invade from New Jersey, but it created some cursed fronts. I was just hoping I'd win before they'd capitulate me, since it'll take less time for me to occupy the best states compared to them occupying mine. The front lines did connect, which let me hold on to Pennsylvania pretty safely. It was quite obvious that the American army was better than mine and would defeat me eventually, but battles just take too long to resolve for the Americans to kick me out, so no matter what they do, I'm occupying Pennsylvania. The war was over soon after, with the rest of the Midwest conquered. Honestly, it'd have been wiser to have grabbed New York and Pennsylvania than those states, but look at that border. It's really nice, and aesthetics are everything, man. Oh, by the way, since I don't have Franco-Canadian as a primary culture, I've been converting the immigrants in Quebec to Anglo-Canadian culture, meaning the Anglophones now form a plurality in Quebec rather than the Francophones. Very cool. I'm also noticing that I've got a ton of peasants, and I really need more construction to possibly keep up with all this immigration, but thankfully, Canada does have a ton of arable land, so those peasants are able to at least get by with subsistence farming. One thing to keep in mind about peasants though is that they're not very wealthy, so they will drag down wages across the entire state, and for that reason, immigration can be worrisome if you don't have the job openings to give them reasonable work. The free Americans have become a minor power by this point, which is good, because it'll be much easier to make them a protectorate and later annex them than conquer all their states over and over, both in terms of infamy and number of wars. I'm also suffering with a completely illegitimate government on account of the massive Liberal Party that just won't split up. I don't know if this is a bug or something, or if I just happen to have researched none of the requisite text for new parties to form, but yeah, this mega tent party is kind of a pain. I can't even try passing a law that an interest group hates to make them revolutionary and exit the government, because my government is illegitimate and can't pass any laws except through political movements. I'm just hoping this will resolve itself eventually when I get texts that unlock new parties. Either way, I went to war with the Free Americans again, with the infamy from a protectorate war being a bit too high, so I decided to take the best states and free New England, who I can conquer separately later. I did the same strategy as last time and landed in New Jersey, which gave me access to Pennsylvania, and then I just held the line until I won. The war ended in 1882, with the Free Americans being reduced to a couple Great Lakes states. By this point we're very close to forming the Free States, but I mean, getting multiculturalism early, which is kind of the whole point of this strategy, isn't really worth much given that I could have just gotten multiculturalism normally by this point. I'm not sure exactly what strategy would possibly work to defeat the Americans so quickly to get multiculturalism early, but if it can be found, early multiculturalism is possible. I went to war with regular America a couple years later to take some Yankee states and release the Confederate states, which means we now live in a world with the Free States of America as a puppet of Oregon, the United States of America, who are ironically split up between Mexico, Tennessee, and Kansas, and the Confederate States of America, which stretch all the way from Maryland to Arizona. Skipping over the American capital of Tennessee. This is the most wonderful timeline, featuring the most important American nation, New England. I've skipped ahead to 1903 since reducing autonomy on my American subjects has been slower than expected. I need to fully annex the Free States to become the Free States, and I guess it would have been much faster to just conquer them, but my mistake. Whatever. So as to save you time, since all I'm doing is ramping up my economy and waiting to annex the Free States, I've skipped ahead to the Free States annexation. Here's me forming the Free States, and finally showing that event that actually gives out multiculturalism. Now here's the funny thing, I have already passed multiculturalism, so it won't show up here, but I promise you, taking the bottom option in this event gives you multiculturalism, and just to demonstrate it, I've gone in and triggered the event in the console commands. There it is. Interesting to note, you also add Afro-American homeland to every Yankee homeland that you have, and gain Afro-American culture as a primary culture. Having Afro-American primary culture is very valuable for the ability to incorporate states with any African heritage in just 5 years, and beyond that, it isn't all that useful. To cap off my beautiful Free States of America, which has abandoned Canadian values in place of American values, I have founded the True North Power Bloc, a trade league with, well, just me in it for now. I'll be pulling in other northerner states as we go. I don't want to drag this video on longer than it needs to be, so I'll just cut to conquering Vietnam as America, then cut to me finishing the war in Vietnam, which by the way had become an Iberian subject in this war, which made the war much longer than it needed to be. Here's a cultural overview, since I haven't shown one yet, and that's mostly because not much of interest was going on. Basically, everyone is becoming Yankee, but Saskatchewan is Japanese, I guess. I had put the Confederates into my power block a while ago by 1913, and then allied with them to attack the United States and make them my protectorate, so as to pull all the disparate Americans into one big power block. Mexico supported them, but of course they stood no chance, and I won the war quickly with Confederate support. The reason I called in the Confederates was just because the American capital in Tennessee would otherwise be inaccessible. I offered the conquest of Tennessee to them to fix the borders, and I personally conquered the other states while making the rest of America, which remained in Mexico, a protectorate. I had gotten Mexico, the nation, into my power block a bit later diplomatically, and with that, at least the markets are unified, except Newfoundland. But I'm done with this playthrough now. I didn't accomplish anything exceptionally noteworthy in this run in terms of stats, but getting this far as a Canadian country is pretty good in my opinion. Check out my ethno-nationalist Henry Ford, by the way. Cars will rule America if this Chad gets into power. Here are my laws. I swapped over to ethno-state as a joke by the end game, but it's definitely unwise to have done so. I did it because most of my nation is Yankee, and any arriving immigrants are having a ton of trouble finding jobs since my peasant population is still huge. It's definitely still weird that you can't assimilate anyone in an ethno-state, but I've whined about assimilation plenty over in my France assimilation video, where I assimilated all of mainland France to French culture. Check out that video next if you enjoyed this one. Thank you for your time.